Archon 888 streaming live on the Theta.tv Edge node with part 3 of Panis, Indigenous Slavery in Canada 1867 to the 1970s. Part 3. Where'd the money come from to fund these wonderful institutions where they beat you like a runaway? I can't say what, 'cause I'm not one, if you run away from the school. And where they feed you rotten food and you're milking cows and slaughtering pigs and you don't get none of that. Where's the money for these schools come from?
From the 1700s to the early 1800s, the relationship between First Nations and the French and British was based on military alliances and trade. The Crown did not have any control over the day-to-day lives of First Nations communities. Over time, the Crown no longer needed a military alliance with First Nations. Canada began to see First Nations as a policy problem that needed to be solved. With the steady growth of settlement, the Crown began to dispossess First Nations of their land. Land was sold and money was given to First Nations in return, but in a very unpredictable and unorganized way that often did not honor what had been agreed upon. Around the early 1860s, a major shift happened in how First Nations money was handled. In a move towards more formalized control, the Receiver General, the government's accountant, would hold on and invest the money on behalf of First Nations. In this new arrangement, 10% was taken off by the Crown, kind of like an administrative tax, while the rest, in theory, was to be held in trust by the Crown for individual bands. During this time, dozens of funds were created and combined into the Indian Trust Fund. A few years later, Britain stopped providing funding for Indian affairs. Canada's solution for dealing with this new responsibility? To use the money in the Indian Trust Fund to fund First Nations Crown relations. Basically, the Crown stole and used First Nations' own money to pay for the Crown's treaty obligations. Indian trust money was also used to pay for colonial infrastructure, growing the wealth of the state while contributing to the impoverishment of Indigenous peoples. Over time, more and more rules were implemented, restricting how First Nations could spend their money in these funds. What began as a relationship based in alliance, slowly and insidiously morphed into a full-blown project of assimilation, with the Crown wielding First Nations' own money as their choice weapon of control. Disorganization, theft, and manipulation of the fund exemplifies the financial relationship that continues today between First Nations and Canada.
In the afternoon, I was taken to the kitchen where I worked alongside other girls peeling potatoes, carrots, and onions. I was also shown how to wash dishes. As I grew older, I did other work in the kitchen, dining hall, and other places. I liked working in the kitchen and decided quite early on that when I grew up, I wanted to be a cook. In my 7 years at Pelican Lake Indian Residential School, the only academic subjects taught were English, arithmetic, and religion. The emphasis was on vocational skills and religion. The boys were taught farming and forestry work skills. The girls learned sewing, cooking, and laundry work. But the first lesson learned was to fear the authority of the people in charge. I quickly learned to march everywhere I went and to talk the way they talked. I had two choices, run away or accept the inevitable.
And you know what happened if you run away?
Dental treatments were withheld from residential schools as part of his research. Lionel Pett distinguished between his experiment and one that would be considered unethical by arguing that it was, quote, not a deliberate attempt to leave children to develop cavities except for a limited time or place or purpose, and only then to study the effects of vitamin C or fluoride. So according to Pett, in other words, the fact that the children were already suffering from the effects of inadequate diets prior to the experiments meant that to his mind it was ethical to use these children, who are wards of the state, as experimental subjects.
Their starvation diets being paid from funds were legally owed to the children.
Now, regardless of whether or not these studies met the ethical standards of the time, which in fact some Medical ethicists have argued that they in fact didn't, even though there was minimal standards at the time. One thing that's clear is they did little to address the widely held and recognized causes of malnutrition in residential schools, which always boiled down to lack of funding for proper food services. And it's worth thinking that this lack of funding was always intentional. You know, when we want to think about intent, Canada intentionally underfunded residential schools.
Well, you
They knew
feed
what
them.
the outcome was going to be.
They grow up big and strong.
By discovering that children were malnourished and then not changing the funding formula, which did not happen, that they were continuing, their decision was to continue to have these conditions in the schools. And the same is true today when we talk about the underfunding of Indigenous healthcare, the underfunding of Indigenous education. These are intentional policies that cause real direct harms to children. Is that we don't know the full extent of medical experimentation in residential schools. Many survivors I've spoken to have told me that the revelations that these experiments happened, these nutrition experiments, only confirmed their suspicions that they were also subjects of medical experimentation in their local communities, in residential schools, in TB sanatoria, and in racially segregated Indian hospitals. Many of you probably don't know, between 1945 and the 1980s, Canada had a system of racially segregated hospitals. Hospitals for non-quote-unquote Indians, and hospitals for Indians. This has received reports from carpenters working on the Brandon Residential School in Manitoba. A school we learned a few years ago was actually the subject of extrasensory perception, or ESP experiments, during the 1940s by...
You really think they're doing extrasensory perception research on these wards of the state without Department of Defense being involved?
Scientists at Duke University. But these carpenters reported that the children, quote, are not being fed properly to the extent that they are garbaging around in barns for food that should only be fed to barn occupants.
It's like Ian was talking about earlier, about the salt. I was there at that time. The person he's talking about is a good friend of mine. He was sitting no farther away than the end of that table. You know, it's a big salt shaker. It's almost as big as this glass. I remember we were having beans that night. You know, and I liked beans because my grandmother used to cook them really good. She'd take all day. See, we didn't have a fancy stoves they got today. We had a wood stove. But the cover came off, and all the salt went into his beans, where we thought they'll get him another plate. The nun went up with a spoon, stirred it all in, and made him eat it.
You wasted the master's salt. How dare
Next
you?
morning, when we got up, he was so swollen, all you could see was the tip of his nose. And they rushed him to the hospital. Because the salt almost killed him.
And if he had died, it would have been one more accident.
And the funny thing is, you know, when it came down to it, you weren't actually considered human.
No. Livestock.
You know? See, when I got there, I couldn't speak or understand English at all. But with the beatings I got for speaking my own language, I learned English pretty fast. You know, when you're told that you're just a savage, you're speaking the devil's tongue, the way you prayed, You're praying to the devil. You were not but a savage. You were no good. You were inhuman. All this being told to you day after day makes you think, what about my parents? What about my grandparents? What about my people? They're savages. You know? So in the end, you're ashamed of who you are.
Now, think about that for a moment. You've taken these children, you've beaten at least some of them mercilessly in front of the others to make an example of them. You've taught them that their parents are devil-worshipping heathens, and that if you go back to the res to learn that you're a treaty people, then you're going to burn in hell. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go, if you're a young man, and you're going to look for a nice Canadian farmer, and you're going to ask to be a laborer on his farm. Or maybe you'll find a timber company and you'll cut wood, or go down into the mines. And if you're a girl, well, I mean, they taught you laundry work, so you can get work in, a hospital laundry or with one of the hotels, make good servile labor.
You're ashamed of your people. You don't want to speak your native language because it's the language of the devil. And all these things float back. You know, I wouldn't send my worst enemy to a place like that. But the food.
I'd send Justin Trudeau there.
Just imagine, even though there was nothing else to eat, this is what you had to eat. Meat that was going bad. A lot of times when they cooked the potatoes, some of them were kind of rotten, so they throw them in anyway. Because all the good vegetables and the meats and everything else went to the priests and nuns.
More than they could ever eat.
7 years of Pelican Lake Indian residential schools, austere surroundings, exacting lessons, hard labor work details, and strict religious services. I saw the school for my last time in 1945. After all is said, I extend a very special thank you to the one kind supervisor, teacher, Miss Goodwin, who took us on outdoor excursions, affording us rare periods of mischievous fun and giving us freedom to speak our native language. Miigwech Miss Goodwin experience was, it taught me skills that I have used every day of my life. I learned to speak and read the English language, to cook, do needlework, and make quilts. Skills that in reality my own mother could have taught me had I gone to school in my village, and not 800 kilometers away. I now know who and what I am, and that I will no longer bow my head in defeat.
Oh, yeah, that's it, man. I mean, those were not ever intended to be institutions of learning where Indigenous people would be taught how to be fully functioning members of society. They were there how to be taught how to be slaves who would think that they were free. Plain and simple.